Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Maartje.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're talking about Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, which came out in 2005. It was directed by Mark Rothemund and written by Fred Breinersdorfer, and it's about the arrest, interrogation, and execution of Sophie Scholl on the 22nd of February 1943, age 21. She was executed to set an example for her role in the German student resistance against the Nazi government. And this movie was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. What did you think of this movie?
I can't say that I enjoyed it because that sounds wrong, but I did enjoy it. I did think it was a very good movie. I'm impressed by how they managed to make it really tense and exciting despite being confined to only a couple of rooms. So I thought that was really good. And for the subject matter, like it's a bunch of interrogations and stuff, it's really exciting. Like you'd think that would be kind of boring because there's a lot of dialogue, but it's actually really good. So I had an enjoyable time watching the movie. How about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes in history movies, and obviously we talk a lot about history movies, I think sometimes it's hard to maybe find that tension because you know what the ending is. And in this case in particular, it does take place over a couple of days, and most of us are at least familiar with the story of Sophie Scholl, so we know how it ends. But nevertheless, they managed to have that tension and that momentum in there. So the whole time you're clocked in, you're super interested in what's happening, even though you know how it ends. And I thought the score really contributed a lot to that. It was super well done. I thought the acting was great. We're going to talk about this a bit more, but they did lift a lot of the dialogue straight from real life. So it feels really historically accurate. It is pretty historically accurate. And yeah, obviously not one that has a super fun, enjoyable ending, but a powerful movie, I think. I enjoyed it.
I was one of the people who had never heard of Sophie Scholl before, so it's for me, it wasn't unexpected because the title pretty much gives away what happens, but I did not know her story, so for me, I didn't know any of the details, or I didn't even know what she was arrested for, apart from the fact that I'd read the 2 lines about the movie that kind of also gave it away. But yeah, I think we should get into the movie. The movie starts with an opening card, as do many of these movies, it seems. It says, "This film is based on historical facts, as yet unpublished transcripts, and new interviews with witnesses." A jaunty tune is playing, and we see 2 young women singing along to an English song on the radio. One of them is Sophie Scholl, played by Juliette Jentz, who leaves to meet up with some compatriots who are preparing anti-government leaflets for distribution. These men include Christoph Probst, played by Florian Stetter, and Sophie's brother Hans Scholl, played by Fabian Hinrichs. They are members of a student resistance group known as the White Rose. They have too many leaflets to mail, so Hans and Sophie decide to distribute the remainder at the university.
I really liked that they opened this movie with Sophie and one of her friends trying to sing along to an English song on the radio, and they're sort of giggly and they're trying to get the words right. It really leaves an impression on you of how young she is. Real life Sophie was 21 when she was executed, and I feel like that more than anything really brings home how much she really was just a university student. She was a young person who had obviously very strong ideals. I just think it's even more impressive that she was so young and she was so committed to the principles that she had.
You kind of get a similar feel, even though she was younger, but Anne Frank is kind of the same, just a regular girl doing extraordinary, heroic things. And I do agree, it's a smart way to just remind you that even though they're doing dangerous stuff, they're also just people and just university students. They have a little squabble too in the beginning, where the other members of the resistance tell them not to risk it, that it's too risky to go to the university because it'll be something different than what they usually do, which they do, for instance, at night, and this is during the day and there'll be lots of people around, so it's very risky.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not to say that they didn't understand the risks, but I do think there's something to be said for them being so young and deciding that if there are consequences, we'll worry about it later. It's like, we have to do this thing. We're excited to do it. We've got these leaflets. It's important for us to do. And whatever else happens, it's down the road. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And I feel like that's such like a young, such a young person's perspective.
Yeah, we'll get to it in the next point when you do the next point. But they do something and I'm like, why? Why take this risk at this very moment? But yeah, maybe that's just being young and kind of having these very strong convictions and maybe not yet the wisdom to think a step ahead, maybe. Not calling them stupid, but just
Yeah, and I wonder if it's also indicative of they are three, well, I mean, there's a group of them, but Sophie and her brother and their friend are like three reasonably privileged young people. I believe that Sophie and her brother's father was a professor, some kind of academic, something like that. So a white collar job. And they've grown up in this country where over the course of their lifespan, it's become gradually and gradually more authoritarian. But I believe their dad had done a little bit of time in prison and that kind of thing. But I do wonder if part of them also was like, well, we're just distributing leaflets. And that's kind of the wild thing too, is really what they're doing is they're not out here setting off bombs or committing violence or hurting people or anything. They are really just distributing leaflets. And I wonder if
Mhm.
it felt to them like any possible consequences wouldn't necessarily be fatal. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense. We get a sense of that in Generation War too. There's a character that gets thrown in jail and then later hanged for defeatist ideas, and it's similar to this. And they're also German, so it's maybe a bit of this can't touch me sense, but apparently it can touch them very severely. So
Yeah. While classes are in session, Sophie and Hans leave leaflets all over campus to be found. So they're kind of setting out these stacks of paper everywhere. So when students come out of the classroom, they'll be like, oh, what's this stack of paper? They're nearly out of time. It's almost the end of classes, but they have a few extra pamphlets. So they take the risk of running up to the second floor and they put these pamphlets on the edge of this railing that looks out over this big atrium that looks out over the first floor. And Sophie kind of impulsively pushes this large stack of leaflets to fall into the atrium, and you see all the paper drifting, swirling down through the air. And a janitor sees them. The class is let out, and they try and get away and blend in with the crowd of students, but a janitor sees them and chases them down. And I've put in my notes here, shout out to the score by Reinhold Heil and Johnny Klimek, because this scene was very tense. And I think a huge part of it was this really intense score.
yeah, very true. It did feel kind of, to me, the music felt a bit dated. I don't know why, but I do agree. It's got like an upbeat tempo and it's like they're walking in time with the music as well, which just makes it even more intense. But this is what I meant when I just said that I didn't really understand this choice of having a couple of extra leaflets and then deciding to risk it all for just a couple more. Like, they've put out so many already, like, surely a couple hundreds. It's what gets them caught. Because the Gestapo arrive and they take Hans and Sophie to the Stadelheim prison. Sophie's cellmate there, Else Gable, played by Johanna Gastorf, is a communist sympathizer and friendly to Sophie's cause. Hans tries to get rid of a draft copy of a new seventh leaflet but gets caught. And this, I didn't initially trust Elsa. I thought she was maybe planted there by the Gestapo. I was very like, is she really sympathetic to the cause or is she just trying to get a confession out of Sophie?
I also thought that. And then I thought, I'm sure they did that on purpose because I'm sure Sophie felt that way. And all of a sudden
Yeah.
you would be looking around wondering who on earth you could trust.
Yeah, because you can tell Sophie when she meets her, and she's like, she has to take off her clothes, I think, in front of this woman. And the woman says, give her anything you have that's incriminating, give it to me. And Sophie's very, very set on making sure that the other woman thinks that she's got nothing. Like, she's very adamant to not give anything up whatsoever.
Sophie is interrogated by Robert Moore, played by Alexander Held, an interrogation specialist for the Gestapo. So, never a great day when you're facing an interrogation specialist for the Gestapo. She initially denies all involvement. I called this scene the scene where Sophie lies her face off because
Mhm.
every time this guy asks her a question, she just on the fly comes up with some answer that's obviously not the truth.
Mhm.
On the verge of being released because she manages to tell a story that you can tell the interrogator doesn't super believe, but he also doesn't have, I guess, enough evidence to contradict her. So she's on the verge of being released. She's just getting ready to sign the paperwork, but the Gestapo find further evidence against her and Hans. I have some notes here because the Scholl family's involvement in anti-Nazi activities is discussed at length in her interrogation. In real life, we know that Sophie was actually arrested by the Gestapo when she was 16, along with several of her siblings, after Hans, her brother, was discovered to be a member of an anti-Hitler youth group. Sophie was released the same day, but Hans was held and interrogated for 3 weeks. It's also true that her father was a former mayor and that he served time in prison in 1942 for criticizing Hitler. So they have a strong family tradition of saying fuck Hitler. And the White Rose, which was a small student group consisting of Hans, Sophie, and their friends, began its acts of passive resistance in June of 1942, distributing anti regime leaflets. And so had Sophie lived, you can imagine that she would have just become even more heavily involved in a resistance movement.
I would have kind of liked if they'd included more of that background into the movie, if the interrogator had maybe mentioned it a bit more. Because obviously he would have been extra suspicious of her, and you don't really get a sense of that when you're watching the movie. I did really like this actor, by the way, Alexander Holt. He was very good and terrifying.
I thought he was good too, especially when he started to get more and more angry with her and he was trying to, he almost, they get into some ideological conversations and he's arguing with her and you can tell that he has really been drinking the Kool-Aid. I thought that this guy did a really good job of giving us the impression of someone who has these, what we would call absolutely outrageous beliefs, but he has managed to do the mental gymnastics to justify it to himself.
And he also seemed almost like he wanted her to save herself in some way, or at least kind of he seemed like he was trying to convince her to make things less bad for herself at some point. I did find his bow tie really distracting and annoying.
Yeah, that's the fashion commentary that the people come to Rosie the Reviewer for. Crucial.
Obviously, the bow tie, it should be outlawed, really.
I don't remember. I think they might have touched on this briefly in the movie, but both Sophie and her brother were in, well, she was in the little girl version of the Hitler Youth, and her brother was in the Hitler Youth. And then, yeah, they did touch on that in the movie. And then after a
Yeah.
while, she started to understand that everything that they were telling her, everything that she was learning from them, she's like, well, this is clearly biased. Like, I know that this is not true, and this is not true, and this is not true. And that's sort of snowballed because we know that in the leaflets that they're distributing in the movie, there's obviously the German government has done a really effective propaganda campaign to convince the German public that the war is going really well and they're minimizing the casualties and and maximizing the victories. And so Sophie's leaflets are all about here's what's really happening on the Eastern Front. Is it worth it that 200,000 Germans have died? Like, XYZ, all this stuff, kind of trying to give people a real picture of what's going on. And so she kind of comes out of Hitler Youth disillusioned and thinking, well, this is not the truth. And she feels it's imperative that she spreads this message of what's actually true to the rest of the population because she thinks that if they knew, they would feel more like she does.
And like we've seen in other movies too, the ideology of a better Germany and a better financial future and that sort of thing, and work and all that sort of thing was what I think she initially believed, as did many Germans, which was the promise of Hitler was that. And he did deliver on some of it, but obviously there's all this other shit that's absolutely unforgivable. So and
Yeah,
thankfully, she saw it for what it was, and so did the rest of her family.
yeah. And she obviously, her and her family were looking more into what's the news that the government is not telling us. And she touches on this in the movie when she's talking to the interrogator and she's telling him about how, the regime has killed all of these disabled people. The regime is committing a
Mhm.
genocide. The regime is doing this and that. And you can tell that the interrogator is completely bewildered. He doesn't believe her. He's like, well, that none of that's been in the news, so it can't be true.
Yeah, I did notice that this movie, like Generation War maybe, did focus on what's happening on the Eastern Front, mostly. She mentions things in Europe very briefly, but mostly it's about the Germans being killed. So it's another one of those. Should they have focused more on the rest of Europe? But I get the choice, really I do, because I guess for Sophie that would have been the main motivator, would have been her own people, the German people that she was trying to defend.
Yeah, and I think she seems to have an understanding too that that is the message that's gonna get across to people, that
Yeah.
if anything, if she's gonna change people's minds, it's gonna be, "Well, actually, this is hurting Germany and not helping Germany."
Exactly, yes, and that's also what the people would have known because they've seen their family members leave for the Eastern Front and return different people or not return at all and stuff like that. So that would make the most sense to them because I don't know how much proof she would have had for any of the other stuff. Probably not very much. So it makes sense. Moore tells Sophie that her brother has confessed to the crime, claimed to have acted alone. Sophie now says that she's proud of her involvement and disputes that Hans acted without her, although she's careful to continue to insist that no one else was involved. She and Moore end up in an almost philosophical discussion, like you said, about conscience versus legality and freedom of speech. When Sophie brings up the terrible things the German regime is doing, including causing the deaths of 200,000 young Germans in a costly bloody war, Moore either approves of the right's decisions or else he denies them.
Yeah, the huge parts of this scene were apparently lifted pretty much whole cloth from transcripts of Sophie's real arrest interviews that sat in an archive until East Germany fell, and then they came to light, and they used them pretty much, word for word in this movie.
I want to just commend the actors too, because this dialogue it's a lot. It's very natural. You can't really tell that they're acting much. It seems really the cadence is really good, and it's in German. Obviously, we watched this in German. I'm just impressed. Is what I'm trying to say.
Oh yeah, I agree. I feel like you could hear about, you could be like, a scene where two people talk about politics doesn't seem that interesting to me, but I don't know, there's something really vital and urgent about it where both of these people are so strong and steadfast in their convictions and each of them are trying to convince the other. I don't know, it
Yeah.
was really fascinating to watch.
I did think Sophie kind of switched really quickly once he told her that her brother had confessed. Like it was like this. All right, then I did do it, and I'm really proud of it.
Yeah. I think that, and we sort of see this play out over the scene where all of the work that they've done can't really have been done by just one person. And so I think in her mind, she's like, well, if I say that I was also involved, then I can convince this guy that nobody else was involved. I can say that I know all the stuff that we did. It was just me and Hans, and no one else was involved here. And that way she could protect the other members of the resistance. That was kind of the vibe that I got.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The night before her trial, Sophie tells her cellmate, Elsa, about her fiance who is fighting on the Eastern Front. She prays to God for strength, but she's firm in her convictions and that she has no regrets. She had been given the chance to sign a paper condemning her actions, but it's important to her that the quote unquote idea survives. And so she doesn't want to, even though if it might save her own life, she doesn't want to come out and say, I don't believe in that anymore. She wants people to know that she died for these principles and that's how important they are. Her
So
defense
strong.
lawyer makes it clear that this will be a show trial. She has little chance of beating the allegations, and it's starting to become very clear that she will probably be executed if they find her guilty, which is looking more and more likely.
The defense lawyer also did not really want to defend her. Like you can tell, he's like there because he has to be, but he's got no intention of helping her whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very like, he was like, well, I've been assigned to you, but you're fucked.
By the way, there's something else. When she's almost released and then arrested again, or at least sent back to the interrogation room, I thought for a second that her friend that she'd seen in the hallway being also interrogated had given them up. It felt to me like that was what happened, but they just found stuff in their apartment. So it's not their friend that gave them up, at least not that we know of in the movie.
Yeah. And truly wild to me that the quote unquote incriminating things that they found in their apartment was like, they bought too many stamps. Like, they have all these stamps in their apartment because they want to mail all these leaflets out. And The Germans are like, this is a truly suspicious number of stamps. Why did you buy these? When did you buy these? What were they for? It's just like,
Yeah.
oh my God.
They do set that up nicely in the very beginning of the movie because you see Hans sticking those into his desk. So they do make a point of showing you all these ridiculous Hitler stamps.
Yeah.
At the trial, President of the People's Court, Roland Freisler, played by Andre Henneke, is full of righteous outrage about the actions of Sophie Hans and her friend Christoph, who has also been arrested. Christoph attempts to save his own life by claiming mental illness and pleading on behalf of his 3 children, but to no avail. Hans keeps his cool when interrogated, calmly explaining that Germany will surely lose the war and will be held accountable for its crimes. Freisler tries to accuse him of dragging his sister into all of this, but Sophie declares that it was her own choice. She also stands by her ideals when questioned.
The real Sophie said similar words. Of course, we have transcripts of a lot of this stuff. She said, somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we did.
We haven't mentioned him yet, but I just want to quickly mention, I don't know what the actor's name is because I didn't look it up, but there's the man that keeps transporting her from her cell into the interrogation room has got a proper Hitler haircut and a mustache, and I wonder if they've done it on purpose.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. They made some truly inspired casting choices in this because the guy who plays Friesler is, I don't know. You guys got to watch this scene. It's like he's yelling. He's so mad. He's the opposite of an impartial judge. He's just screaming at them about how they're betraying the Reich and, they're betraying their people. And he's just clearly has also drank the Kool-Aid. I don't know. He's approaching his job with gusto, and this was a guy, Friesler was president of the People's Court for a while, so he is responsible for the deaths of a lot of resistance fighters.
Also, he's actually just spitting at this point. He's like, I've never seen anyone so angry. He's so angry. It
He's
almost made
banging
me.
on the desk.
Yeah, it just almost made me laugh a bit, even though it's not funny. It's you can just tell like the courtroom is full of like old men too. Just all of them are just men, except for the typist, who's as usual is a woman. You can tell that even though they're in the court, they don't have a chance in hell of getting away from the court. Not even Christoph, who looked pretty rough, to be honest. Out of all of them, yeah, looked like he was going through it.
Yeah, Christoph had a lot to lose. I believe they said his wife was sick. He obviously has the 3 kids, and he's realizing now that he really fucked up.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Sophie and Hans, neither of them are married, they don't have kids. And I think in their minds, they're a bit more ready and willing to give up everything for the cause if they have to, now that they're here anyways.
Yeah.
The 3 are given the chance to make a final statement. Both Hans and Sophie declare that their prosecutors will soon be where they are now, standing trial, and all 3 are sentenced to death. And they're right that their prosecutors will eventually stand trial, but unfortunately, I believe we're in 1942, so it's a few years in the making on that one.
I wonder if this actually happened, that Hans says something like, if you're gonna condemn anyone, condemn me and not Christoph. So he tries to give Christoph another chance, but Friesler is not having it at all. He's like, nope, you shut up.
Yeah, both Hans and Sophie really go out of their way to try and not incriminate anyone else, and they're both refusing to name names. And anytime the interrogator brings up the name of one of their friends or one of their collaborators, Sophie comes up with, again, lying her face off, coming up with excuses of why she had to meet with this person and why she was speaking with that person. And they do their best to make sure that they're the only ones who have to wear this. And I think part of it is this sense of being committed to the group and really wanting to make sure that their friends don't get hurt. But also, it's if all of us get executed, then this little resistance movement dies.
Yeah, I did think, obviously, it didn't save her, but I thought something was really clever. Like, when she couldn't make up a good story about something, she would just say she wasn't there. So she couldn't incriminate anyone else. So I thought that was really clever, but I wish it would have saved her, though. Sophie had been told that there would be a 99-day delay between sentence and execution, But when she's given a chance to write some final letters by the prison guard, tells her, "You better write it today." She understands that she will soon be executed and probably on the same day. She gets a blessing from a prison chaplain and says goodbye to her parents, which I thought was really broke my heart a bit. She gets to meet Christoph and Hans one more time and they have a little cheeky smoke. And then as they are led out of the building, she says, "The sun still shines."
Sophie's last words are disputed, but it's likely either the sun still shines or God, my refuge unto eternity. Apparently, the prison guards were so impressed by their strength and their bravery that that's why they let her smoke with Christoph and Hans one more time because they weren't supposed to do that. And I
Yeah.
agree with you, the little meeting that she had with her parents was very sad, but her father told her that he was proud of her and she was doing what was right, which, oof.
I'm amazed he wasn't arrested on the spot for that, to be honest. I wouldn't have put it past him to just arrest him right there.
Yeah. Throughout the movie, there's this through line of her religious beliefs, and she talks a lot about, in her interrogation about what God would want. And then when she's alone in her cell, she's praying and she's not praying for herself, but she's finding some comfort in religion. And then she gets her little blessing from the chaplain at the end, and that seems to bring her some comfort. So,
Yeah, and similarly, there's another kind of theme where she's constantly looking out the window to see if the sun's still shining. So there's these two things that give her hope. One of them is religion, and the other one is the sunshine. And I thought it was really kind of telling that there's a moment in the movie where the interrogation gets really intense, and the interrogator closes the shutter or some kind of curtain or blind, and there's no sunshine, and that's the darkest moment of the film. So I thought that was actually quite clever filmmaking.
yeah, that was great. And man, there is something so metal about, her last words being the sun still shines because it goes along with this thing, this idea that she has where it's like, even if she dies, that doesn't mean that the idea dies and the sun still shines. It's like, yeah, you can kill me, but this seed of resistance will grow and ultimately the Reich will fall. And I just thought, just such a cool line. I mean, you wish that, if anything ever happened like that to you, that you would be able to think of something that cool that would resound down through history like that.
Exactly, and it appeals to me more for obvious reasons than the religious part of it because I'm very not religious. So I like the metaphorical sunshine as well as the actual sunshine. Like it's such a good movie device as well.
Yeah. The screen goes black as Sophie is put into the guillotine. We hear her execution, which is almost worse, if I'm honest, as well
Yes.
as that of Hans and Christoph, but it's just a black screen and we're just hearing the sounds. An end card lists the names of the members of the White Rose who were executed or otherwise punished.
Quite a few of them, actually. There were quite a couple more that were executed than we know of in the movie. It's really rough, and even the ones who didn't get executed did get severely punished as well. I think it's Hans that shouts something right before he's executed, and that just chilled me to the bone. I was like, oh, jeez.
Yeah, but it was something very, he was resisting right to the end. It's something like long live freedom or something like that.
I can't remember what he said. I've already forgotten, but I was just in shock of hearing their heads drop into baskets without seeing it. I'm like, Jesus, this is really dark. And you're right, it's more effective when you don't see it and just hear it. It's such a chilling moment.
Yeah, I think it helps to make the movie a lot less about that specific moment in time, the gruesomeness and the darkness of that, and more about, everything that kind of led up to that.
Yes. A final card reads, thanks to Helmut von Moltke, the sixth leaflet of the White Rose was taken to England via Scandinavia. In mid 1943, millions of copies were dropped by Allied planes over Germany. They now bore the title A German Leaflet, Manifesto of the Students of Munich.
Yeah, I loved this. There's a shot of all of these papers falling down out of the sky, and it's such a nice thing to think about that Sophie was right, that even though they killed her, they couldn't stop the spread of her idea. Super fitting. Von Moltke was a member of the German military intelligence service, the Abwehr, who formed an opposition group of like-minded friends, and he would leak information about the Nazis to the Allies. So he was working for the Nazis, but he was also an informant. He ended up being executed by the Nazi government in January of 1945 after a show trial also headed by Roland Friesler. In one of his final letters to his sons, he wrote, "Since National Socialism came to power, I have striven to make its consequences milder for its victims and to prepare the way for a change. In that my conscience drove me, and in the end, that is a man's duty." I just have some notes here. The janitor who turned them in, his name was Jakob Schmidt, and he was arrested after the war for turning them in.
Hmm.
He lost his job and was sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp. And though he was an avowed card carrying Nazi, he claimed that he had turned the Scholls in only because distributing pamphlets was against university policy.
Lies. It's lies.
I almost feel like partly I think that it is true because that's almost one of the things that makes parties like the Nazi party get into power and stay in power because so many people are like in this case of Jakob Schmidt, he's like, well, students aren't supposed to be delivering, pamphlets on campus. And so it's just like such a minor thing where he was like, well, you disobeyed the rules of the Third Reich, so I'm going to turn you in. And it's just like everyday people doing like little shitty things like that are that are
Hmm.
the reason almost why parties like the Nazis are able to stay in power. I don't know. I just thought that
Yeah.
yeah, part of the reason why he did it probably was because he was miffed that these kids were making a mess on his campus, and he was just like, well, you disobeyed the regime, so you're going to face the consequences, and I don't care if those consequences are you getting killed.
It's like when you have the Dutch NSB and you've got members that say we're good families and they just look the other way when they see a Jewish family get taken out of their homes. It's those little things that aren't as evil on their own. Like, it's shitty but not super evil, but to put it all together, it makes the regime work. So it's, yeah, you're definitely right.
Yeah, you worded it much better than I did. That's exactly what I mean, yeah. Also, if anyone's interested, there's an Instagram account called Ich bin Sophie Scholl, which was a project where an actor posted as Sophie each day, as if Sophie had Instagram and she was, posting throughout her resistance activities and that kind of stuff. It's kind of cool. And obviously, Instagram, they posted in German, but Instagram has a function where you can translate it. And so I was going through and looking at some of those, and it was kind of neat.
I like when people make stories like these accessible to like a younger generation because otherwise you're gonna have to really look for it, and this way it just comes your way. I'll put a link to it on the website, as always.
We should rate this movie. I don't know what funny thing we could possibly rate this movie because there's not even a single second of levity in it.
I
Except,
do, I do. I have an idea. Stupid bow ties out of 10.
perfect. Yeah, because you know what? Fuck that Nazi and his clothing decisions.
Exactly.
All right, how many stupid bow ties out of 10 would you rate this movie?
I find it really difficult to rate because it's so different from any other movie that we've seen, so I can't really compare it to anything. I think I would give it maybe 8 stupid bow ties out of 10 because I did find it really interesting and well done. I can't really find anything that I disliked about it, but I wouldn't as soon watch it again because it's so dark. So it's not your let's watch this once a year because it's a fun movie kind of movie. It's just decent. The acting is good. The writing I think is really good. It's another perspective again, which I liked. So yeah, just good ratings, but not let's watch this every week. How about you?
Yeah, this is such an important story. I think if you don't know the story of Sophie Scholl and her brother and their compatriots, it's certainly worth a watch. You can find this movie on YouTube. I don't know if it's supposed to be on YouTube, but it is. And it's just one of those things where I think sometimes people like to make excuses for people in the past of like, oh, so and so was a product of their time, or the everyday Germans supported the regime because they couldn't do anything else. And Sophie is just such an example of the fact that There have always been people willing to stand up for what's right, even, against overwhelming social belief or whatever. And I think that it's a really important message. Again, we talked about this with Anthropoid, but that there are people willing to make great sacrifices in order to do the right thing. Yeah, super powerful movie. I enjoyed the acting. I enjoyed that they took so much from actual history. There really is no need to embellish it and change things. Like what actually happened is so fascinating in its own right. And yeah, I enjoyed it. So I'm going to give it an 8 stupid bow ties out of 10. I think that people should definitely watch it. As you said, it's a little grim. You might have to be in the right mindset. But also, ultimately, I think that Sophie's message and the way that she articulates herself so ably and is right up until the very end standing by her principles and trying to change people's minds. There is something like almost a little bit uplifting about that. So there is that too.
Yeah, and I just want to add, and I think I touched on it in the very beginning of this episode, but it might sound a little boring, like watching only interrogation, but the pacing of this movie is excellent. You are constantly engaged by what's going on, and I can't really tell what it is that makes this happen, but you won't be bored, even though it's a lot of talking. So do check it out, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, dare I ask if you're reading anything?
You dare not ask. Please don't ask.
Well, I am getting started on Catch 22 because we are going to do an episode pretty soon, which I'm very excited about because I've read Catch 22 a few times. It's an old favorite of mine that I go back to. So
I'm gonna have to read so many books in the next 3 weeks if I'm gonna be able to say anything useful about any of those books that we're covering. But also, I did see the Catch 22 miniseries, so I know a little about it, but not like super much. And I, of course, know the saying or the principle of Catch 22, which is interesting in itself. So I know a little about it, but I will read it, I promise.
well, we're also going to have a guest on that episode who knows quite a lot about Catch 22 and World War II novels. So it will be an interesting discussion. And if you don't read the book, we'll just do a fun episode where Mark just makes things up sometimes and you guys can figure out what's real and what's not.
Maybe I'll have a little cheeky drink on the side then. Just to be
Yes.
funnier than usual.
We will be recording this over Christmas, so we can't guarantee that it's going to be a sober Catch 22 episode, but I think that's what Yossarian would have wanted.
Exactly. All right. Thanks everybody for listening. You can follow us wherever you get your podcast. What else can you do? You can send this episode to a friend. And also the last couple because they're really good. And you can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. Or you can visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com, for extra information. Did I leave anything out?
No, I think you got it all.
Perfect. I will see you next week.
Bye.